launch this book with you all today. Our book, China's Economic and Political Presence in the Middle East and South Asia, co-edited with my great co-editor, Luciano Zaccara, has just been published by Routledge a few weeks ago, and we're now happy to launch it today. I would like to thank our sponsors for organizing this webinar today, Qatar University's Ibn Khaldun Center for Humanities and Social Sciences, the Gulf Studies Center, as well as Durham University's Sheikh Nasser Al Mohammed Al Sabah program. So a brief introduction. Basically, this project was established by the Ibn Khaldun Center at Qatar University in 2019. We basically circulated a call for abstracts in the fall of 2019 with the objective of organizing a conference in 2020. But unfortunately, due to COVID, that got canceled. But we were very adamant to try to publish the works of the contributors. There were more than 40 abstracts that were sent, and the 11 chapters that we have, the 10 contributors, basically are covering a wide range of issues related to China's relations in the Middle East and South Asia. We're covering countries Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, the GCC states, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Israel. While the major parts of each chapter are dedicated to the economic aspect of the relationship, we're not really focused on the BRI per se. Rather, we're looking at the history of the relationships bilaterally as well as regionally, and to basically ascertain China's future political and economic presence in these countries. I will now want to just pass to Dr. Ehteshami, who is the editor of the series editor of the Durham Middle East and Islamic World series, for brief remarks.
But thank you very much. And first of all, congratulations to the editors and the contributors to this volume. I'm delighted to be partnering the Gulf Studies Center and the Bakir Center at Qatar University to be sharing this launch. In terms of who I am and my series with Routledge, the Durham Model Miss Islamic World series has been going since the early 2000s. So it's over 20 years old. And for those who are not familiar with it, we've published 56 volumes so far. So we are prolific and comprehensive at the same time. The mission of the series is to be truly global in terms of its authorship, in terms of cosmopolitanism, in terms of its international purview, looking at the world beyond it. We encourage diversity of voices, but also diversity of ideas and research approaches. So it is, for all intents and purposes, an inclusive series. We encourage bringing in, for want of a better term, young, early career researchers alongside established scholars. This is important in the context of the volume in hand that I will mention also. We've been encouraging scholarship on Asia since 2004. In fact, those who are familiar with the series will recall that the first volume in the series was called The Middle East Relations with Asia and Russia, that I myself co-edited with colleagues at the Foreign Office in London. We look in particular on inter-Asian relations, on key Asian actors, large or small, powerful or weak, it really doesn't matter. We look at politics, political economy, international relations, sociology, anthropology of Asian countries, but also Asian regions. We are not state-centric. We are dynamic as in terms of our ethos. The earlier volume I mentioned was number 5 in our series. The current volume to hand is in the 50s. So we've traveled a long way in time and space to be here. That earlier volume is modest. I have it here in case you haven't seen it, and it only has 160 pages, and only, just to be sure for the record, 8 chapters. The current volume is far more comprehensive, and it is attractive for a number of reasons. First, that it's edited by two distinguished scholars who have already begun to make a mark on study of the region, but also comparative politics. And this book fits very nicely in the genre of comparative politics. It is a hugely interesting volume because its coverage is comprehensive. It's not just the Middle East, it covers South Asia. It is truly international in terms of its makeup. We can see today colleagues hailing from across regions to be joining us in this webinar. Its authorship also covers all ages and a mix of genders and ethnicities. So it fits very nicely the ethos and the philosophical approach that the series has towards developing scholarship and celebrating quality scholarship. So when this volume presented itself, having been familiar in terms that Mehran has talked about, the spirit and intentions of the organizers of the original meeting, it was no-brainer for me to encourage them to develop this into a volume. And I'm delighted that through our discussions of over 2 years, gentlemen, I was able to present this to Peter Sowden, my colleague at Routledge, as commissioning editor, and the board accepted it without any negative voices unanimously, given the quality of the volume that we have. And I'm hoping that we will have 6 presentations that will speak to the diversity of issues tackled, but also the quality of scholarship that is in this volume. So I won't take any further time that I have to Mehran. Again, to thank you for the invitation and to congratulate you and Luciano and the contributors for having put together such an excellent volume.
Thank you very much, Professor Ehteshami. I will also now pass to Dr. Peter Sowden, who is also an editor at Routledge. Dr. Sowden. Are you with us?
I think he was, but I cannot see him right now.
Then we will hopefully get back to him before the discussion session. Dr. Zaccara, could you please provide your remarks as the great co-editor of this book?
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Mehran for inviting me to join in this very interesting book. And also I want to appreciate Peter for his work at the publisher, and of course the kind remarks made by Anoush about the content of this book. And actually I think this is one of the most remarkable things that we were able to achieve in this volume. We have 11 chapters that they are dealing, as Anoush said, with different regions, not only with the MENA and GCC region as the general, but dealing with some specific cases that sometimes are not dealt specifically in other volumes, like Israel, Bangladesh, Pakistan, or Afghanistan, in terms of a Chinese approach to the West. And as Mehran mentioned, even though the Belt and Road Initiative is mentioned in most of the articles, in most of the chapters, because at some point there are some elements that they are transversal to all the chapters, we didn't dedicate one specific chapter to the BRI initiative or the Belt and Road Initiative specifically, but we wanted to incorporate in every of the chapters. And last but not least, I wanted also to appreciate all the contributors that they had. They did a great job, both presenting their papers and, of course, accepting most of the comments we made. I mean, it's sometimes very annoying when you receive the comments from your editors. And sometimes most of the people tend to say, okay, I will do some of them, but I will try not to address most of the changes. But most of you accepted most of the changes. We are very happy that this book is finally out. And also to recognize that most of them are already well-established faculty, even though they are all very young. I think I am the oldest one in all this book manuscript, which is good on one side, but it's not very good on the other side. So all that said, I will turn back the word to Mehran, that will start giving the word to all of you to present your chapters, and hopefully we will have enough time for a Q&A to discuss some of the aspects discussed by these 6 authors. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So basically, you can see the table of content here. We are not going to have the 10 chapters, the 10 main chapters presenting. We have 6 of them today. I will just briefly mention that the 4 other chapters who are not present today. The first one is by Dr. Umit Alperen. He's basically discussing the strategic transformations of China's relations with GCC states from a unidimensional relationship to a multi-layered partnership. He's an assistant professor at the Süleyman Demirel University in Turkey. Mr. Lucas Kratzer, he wrote on China's role in post-war Syria. Does it strengthen or undermine the Sino-Russian cooperation, which gives another angle to the book. He's a research fellow at the Historical Archives of the Hungarian State Security in Hungary. Professor Jikun Zhu, he wrote on the Israel factor in the dynamic relations between China and the Islamic world. This chapter was particularly interesting to realize how the Islamic world is reacting to China's interactions with Israel and how that plays in the wider Middle East policies of China. Professor Zhu is a professor of political science and international relations at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania. And chapter 10 was by Nur Mohammad Sarkar, China's security cooperation with Bangladesh and Pakistan in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, implications for Indian Ocean geopolitics. He is a research fellow at Bangladesh Institute of Law and International Affairs in Bangladesh. We will now start with the 6 presentations, but just before I would like to mention on a personal note that it's quite sad for me that our colleagues in Iran cannot join us on this webinar because of the internet limitations and whatnot, as well as what happened a few days ago at Sharif University. I want to express my support to them. We will now start with Dr. Amin Mohseni and Hamid Wafai, who wrote on China in the Middle East and North Africa, an empirical inquiry on China's expansion towards the West.
Thank you, Mehran. Allow me to share my screen. Does everybody see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you for having me present the chapter here, Mehran, today. And I want to thank you as well as Luciano and also Anoush for organizing this edited volume. It's very timely. I know some of the data I'll be presenting here, it goes before the pandemic and before the Russia-Ukraine war. So a lot have changed since then. But the main points I think are still valid, but I think the nuances around China's involvement in the region, we have to pay attention with the post-COVID environment and also the post-Russia Ukraine crisis situation in the region. But allow me to start. So the objective of this chapter was to provide a political economy analysis of China's involvement in the MENA region, mainly the Muslim MENA region, and also provide a lot of data and have the data speak for themselves. As an economist, we love working with the data. So this chapter has about 13 figures and 8 tables, and I want to thank you, Mehran and Luciano, to accommodate all of these tables and figures in the chapter. I know editors don't like to have many of them, this many of them, but it was inevitable because we wanted to cover China's relationship in the MENA from 3 different angles for the past 2 decades. Of course, the energy is the first one, but trade and also investment are the 2 other huge areas that we wanted to cover. So I'll touch briefly on these 3 areas, and if there are any quick questions I can take probably or leave it for the discussion. So in the past decade, nearly half of China's oil imports are sourced from the MENA region. As you can see from this graph, the MENA countries are in orange and the rest of the countries are in blue, and these are the top 10. So as you can see, the MENA countries are sourcing around, exactly to be exact, 48% of China's oil. And when it comes to natural gas, it's less because China is importing a lot of its natural gas through Russia, through pipeline. But again, MENA countries such as Qatar which have huge LNG capacity. They're also exporting substantially to China. I removed that data because that data, again, has changed significantly from 2018, but the oil figure has remained relatively the same. Therefore, I'm putting this out here right now. When it comes to so China's dependence on the MENA region from MENA's energy resources is a clear fact. When it comes to trade, I would like to bring to your attention that China has overtaken United States as the largest trading partner of the MENA region as a whole after the 2007-2009 great financial crisis. I mean, if you see the graph before the financial crisis, right around this time, China was lagging US, and the lag was consistent. You know, as US was increasing, China was increasing, but US was always ahead of the game. Right after the financial crisis, China overtakes US in terms of trade. That means both imports and exports with the MENA region, and the gap just keeps growing. The reason behind this is twofold. Number one is certainly that US in the past decade and a half has been trying to become more energy independent relatively compared to before the financial crisis. So US's energy imports from the region has not increased significantly, while China's energy imports from the region over the past decade and a half has increased substantially. So that's one reason China has overtaken the US. Nonetheless, China is again the largest trading partner. And also the second reason that one can allude to is that China's policy is wait and see. They always they don't want to confront their rivals, especially the US, head on in many issues and in many regions as well. So therefore, they just look for opportunities to fill in the gap or fill in the void, as you might want to say it, when the US leaves some area open, or when the US presence declines, and China is ready to immediately fill in that gap. And the reason I'm saying this is because I want you to pay attention to this similarity between sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East. When I was looking at the data, I thought, oh my God, I made a mistake. I copied and pasted Middle East data for sub-Saharan Africa, but no, it was not. The numbers are different, certainly, right? You can see the numbers right here are different from here. But the similarity of the two regions, the way China's trade with sub-Saharan Africa region, again, after the great financial crisis, skyrocketed and overtook the US, the stock similarity just, is just pointing to one fact. Yes, China, again, needs energy imports from sub-Saharan Africa, but this similarity between the two regions, it just talks about to the fact that when US leaves, China fills in the gap. Both in sub-Saharan Africa, the data that we have, US trade with sub-Saharan Africa has been declining over the past decade, and Russia and China's has been increasing steadily. Again, these are pre-COVID, 2020, post-COVID, we have to see what has been happening. When it comes to countries in the region, back to MENA again, you can see the blue is the bilateral trade with China of each of the countries, and the orange is a bilateral trade with the US. And you can see that China has is larger than in 2018, is larger than the US for most countries, and specifically, let's say for Oman, for Iran, of course, because of the sanctions, and also some other countries in the region like Kuwait. China is a significant trading partner, and the US role has been declining. Moving into investment. Yes, China has been investing in all regions of the world, but since 2015, MENA has been the top destination for Chinese investment. This small table here. So this is showing the investment in billions of dollars in 2007, 2012, and 2018. So you can see China has been growing steadily in most regions. Let me just bring the regions up again. Yes, I mean the regions here, I'm sure I forgot to include them. But in the MENA region since 2015, the size of Chinese investment has grown by 137%, the largest from all other regions. Like Latin America and Caribbean grow by 44%, Europe by 25%, but all the other regions, for instance, since 2015 to 2018, there was a decline in investment from Chinese. But in the MENA, 137% increase. And my last slide, which sectors are the Chinese investing in the world and also in the MENA region? Energy, transport, real estate, metals. These are the top 4 sectors that has come up over and over in sub-Saharan Africa, in MENA, in other regions as well. But of course, in the MENA region, nearly half of Chinese investment is in the energy sector, and that's not surprising. Again, in the MENA region, we see utilities have some good share of Chinese investment, and again, transport, real estate, and metals are where China is investing heavily, not only to be the largest source of refined rare earth minerals, but also providing its expertise and engineering services when it comes to transport and real estate, creating jobs for Chinese companies and also Chinese labor force in the MENA region. And also the same is true in sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries. So I have 10 minutes. I think my time is up, and I'll take your questions hopefully at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next 2 chapters are on Iran. They're by my colleagues, Jacopo Scita and Esfandyar Batmanghelidj. We will start with Jacopo.
Hello, I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, thank you so much, Mehran and Luciano, for having me in this book, and Anoush, which of course is my PhD supervisor, for publishing it. I'll be very, very brief, to be honest. And rather than give a sort of sum up of my chapter, I'll definitely try to contextualize it, and I'll be brief for 2 reasons. One is that, of course, the time is limited. The other one is that I really want to hear your chapters explained, because I'm very, very interested and fascinated by his research, as you know, is better than me. So first of all, where does my chapter come from? Well, this is basically part of, or at least the theoretical conceptualization at the base of my PhD thesis, which I'm gonna defend in 10 days, basically. So quite a timely moment to speak about it. And the basic idea that sustained my chapter and my PhD thesis again is that I think there was some sort of need to look at China-Iran relations from a broader perspective. So trying to give a sort of framework, build up a framework to analyze China-Iran relations that could sustain changes and appreciate historical changes and future changes within this relationship. So I know there are a lot of very distinguished work, distinguished paper, distinguished chapters, distinguished knowledge about China-Iran relation that is proliferating these days, even more so, but they're all very precise. They look at very niche aspect of their relationship, which is of course very interesting and important. But my idea was to try to define a broader framework. And what I found interesting and helpful in doing that is the so-called role theory of international relations, which I'm not gonna deal very much with that in this presentation, because it would take probably at least 2 hours. I leave this for my viva, PhD viva, and but I think exploring what role China has historically played and will continue playing in its relationship with Iran, and try to define it, is a very helpful again tool to have a broader perspective and a broader overview of what pushes China and Iran to cooperate, what limits this cooperation, what makes, what basically emerge from this relationship and will continue to emerge in the future. And basically what I found out is that this role that I'm trying to define, I've defined in this chapter and in my PhD thesis, as basically 2 major components. One is a structural one, I would define it, which is described as an archetypical great power, middle power relations. So what I mean by that is that, of course, Iran can be defined as a middle power, and Luciano has written a lot about that, Anoush too. So we can locate Iran as a middle power, while China is most definitely a great power. So this the interaction that emerged from these two categories, these two definitions, provides a sort of what I call a semi-rigid framework within which China performs its role in the relationship with Iran. So, of course, the important point that we must understand is that this semi-rigid framework, the great power, middle power framework, is what mainly influences policymaking within the relationship. So it's wrong, thinking that China is dealing with Iran and Iran deals with China on the romantic base of the relationship, which, although, is the second component of this role. So the good and the interesting elements of Sino-Iranian relationship, and role theory helps appreciate that, is that, again, there are these two elements living together. One, again, is this great power, middle power framework, so structural framework. The other one is a more ideal one. So, of course, the relationship is built and described upon this idea of these two historical empires, that had friendly interaction over history, that have been subject to national humiliations from the West at various points in the history. So there's this sort of mythical past and the same dissatisfaction towards the Western-led international system that is a constant, a recurrent element of how these two countries describe their relationship. However, the impact that this aspect has on policymaking is, of course, limited, because material interest and, again, the structural limitation imposed by the great power, middle power framework is what ultimately define policymaking. What this ideational element in the role does is helping and lubricating the partnership, especially when policymaking is not up to what, for example, Iran expects from the partnership, from the relationship with China. Then the narrative steps in and helps, giving substance somehow, and somehow, and somehow help China to get out from the cul-de-sac of policymaking. So I think these two components are what really form China's role in the relationship with Iran. And in this chapter, I define this role as the role of the modern anti-imperialist agent. Of course, this was an early definition I get from Carl Oste's original and groundbreaking work on international roles. In my PhD thesis, this has evolved. I actually developed my own definition of China's role in the relationship with Iran. What I think, and I'm concluding with that, is, again, it's very important for us to find a framework to understand China-Iran relationship between the day-to-day development of this partnership. And this is a very modest attempt to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Yar.
Thanks, Mehran. Let me just share my screen. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present, and thank you again to Mehran and Luciano for editing the volume. I think it's a fantastic project, and the papers really came together in an interesting way. So for my presentation, I'm talking about my chapter, which looks at Iran's eastward turn in a turning world. And the purpose of this paper was really to try and look at a very simple question. Did Iran indeed turn east in the period in which it started to become subject to Western sanctions? And was that eastward turn really driven by sanctions? Now, the reason that this is an important question is that it's one that comes up often because Iranian officials in recent years have talked about a turn east strategy as part of their response to increased isolation under Western sanctions. And the narrative that's emerged is that not only is there a strategic commitment on the part of Iranian leaders to turn towards the east, but that commitment has been matched by a growth in the economic role of China in Iran, which is something that also Professor Cheraghlou referred to in his charts. What I wanted to do in this paper was really to look more closely at the data here and to try and understand, was it the case that sanctions were responsible for that shift? Methodologically, the paper is very simple. I'm basically looking at really one set of data, but I'm looking at it in a comparative framework, which I think is something that has been missed out upon in a lot of studies of Iran's economy, and particularly how Iran's economy has shifted under sanctions. What you'll see here is the main table from the paper. And the table shows you the proportion of SITC 7. SITC is basically a nomenclature system for different kinds of goods. It's a way of categorizing goods that are traded between countries. And SITC 7 is the category related to basically machinery and mechanical equipment. And this is important because Iran's imports of machinery and mechanical equipment are fundamental to the manufacturing base of the country, and are probably actually, I would argue, more important economically than Iran's oil exports. One way to think about it is that Iran exports oil to earn money that it then uses to procure the parts and equipment for its domestic manufacturing base, which is relatively developed. And so in order to understand how important China is with regards to these, the importation of these goods by Iran, we look at the ratio of China, the US, and the EU28 as suppliers in relation to the sum total of the value of trade from these three trade partners with Iran. And here you'll see the results for that analysis for 1995 to 2018. For Iran and also many other countries of a diverse sort of level of development and a diverse kind of geographic spread. And you can see very clearly that Iran, which is the fifth country in the table, in 1995, 7.1% of its trade was from China relative to the other, the sum total of the trade from those three partners in these categories. By 2018, that ratio had risen dramatically to 52.9%. So the majority of the trade being done by these three partners, China was the largest share. Now, it might be easier to look at this in a chart. So I've prepared one. And you could argue that the US was always a minimal trade partner with Iran because Iran was under primary sanctions basically since 1979. So what this chart does is it shows the ratio of Chinese machinery exports to Iran to European machinery exports to Iran and other countries. When that ratio is over 1, it indicates that China is a larger supplier of machinery than the European Union. And what you can see is that in the red line, Iran, right around 2010, when you started to get a tightening of the sectoral sanctions on the country, there's a real acceleration in Iran's increased dependence on China as a supplier of machinery. But it's worth noting that you see growth in China's share in all of the countries basically that we're analyzing here. And that in a sense, during the period in which sanctions were in force, particularly from, let's say, 2012 through the implementation of the nuclear deal in 2016, Iran became more alike Indonesia, Pakistan, Thailand, the Philippines with regards to this indicator. And so you could argue that almost at a theoretical level, Iran really was shifted towards Asia, did kind of turn east. However, I think it's a mistake to interpret that as meaning that sanctions were the primary driver, because of course this was a relationship, a growing trade relationship that we saw across regions. And as Professor Cheraghlou showed earlier, you can see a similar development in the MENA region and in sub-Saharan Africa in regards to China's dominance. And to explain this, I, for example, here have included a quote from John Garver's study of Sino-Iranian relations in 2006. And he points to something that was happening at the time, which is that China was becoming an industrial exporter in this period. Those goods were typically cheaper than Western goods. They were easier. Chinese companies were creating incentives to make the adoption of those goods and that equipment more attractive. And at the same time, China was adopting Western technology, but not having qualms about transferring that technology to Iran. And for many developing countries, this, I think, was the more fundamental driver for the growing relationship. The second factor to consider is that at some stage, sanctions are also an inhibitor of deeper economic ties. So it's true that China's trade relationship with Iran has grown significantly. But what we have not seen in the period in which Iran has been under secondary sanctions is a significant increase in the role of China as an investor in the Iranian market. As an example of this, in the period in which the Trump administration was reimposing maximum pressure sanctions in the latter part of 2018, China's main bank for facilitating Iran trade with Iran actually halted all transactions that were not humanitarian in nature. And in December of that year, in a sort of frank statement, Javad Zarif, the then foreign minister, said, "At the time being, looking to the east is as meaningful as looking to the west." So this is an indication that sanctions may have driven some of the growth in the trade relationship, but at the end of the day, the economic ties were still constrained by the sanctions. So why does that sort of observation matter? Well, I think it's important because a comparative framework, like the one offered in the chapter, makes clear that Iran's increased economic dependence is not explained by the imposition of sanctions alone. The world has changed significantly since the early 2000s, and even if sanctions are lifted, we would see it as totally normal, actually, for Iran to be generally economically dependent on China. That's the case for, frankly, most of the countries included in this analysis now. The second is that if we have that comparative framework in mind, we can better understand the China-Iran partnership in its true political and economic dimensions. And I think this goes back to some of the things that Jacopo said, where it's very easy to assume that when there's a political slogan and some growth in trade, then that strategy is being implemented as intended. That's certainly not the case when it comes to the China-Iran partnership, which has struggled, I would say, in the last decade because of the complicating factor of sanctions. So thank you for the opportunity to present the chapter, and thank you again to the editors for an excellent volume.
Thank you very much, Yar. We will now go to Vorachai. He will be presenting one of the two chapters on China-GCC relations. Vorachai, please.
Hi, thank you, Mehran and Dr. Zaccara, for the opportunities. I'm going to touch on my chapter, which is chapter 5, China's foreign policy in the Middle East and the positions of the GCC states. The diplomatic relations of China and the GCC states have grown tremendously in the past 5 decades, shaped and influenced by the international and regional power play effort with China's own strategies and foreign policy. I would say that if we look at Chinese foreign policies, we should look at the year of 1978. Before 1978 was a profound year in Chinese history when Beijing initiated its socialism with Chinese characteristic by Deng Xiaoping, which launched China into the global limelight. And this reform opened a new front in China's foreign policy where political objectives were relegated to multilateral economic engagement. And the subsequent economic growth necessitated the consumption of large amounts of energy, particularly crude oil. So because of this, the GCC states were able to facilitate China's rising energy demand, marking the beginning of strategic multilateral and economic relations. And currently, China's foreign policy toward the Middle East focused on strong economic interests that are bound to grow even further. So in this chapter, This chapter analyzed China foreign policy goals with a specific view on diplomatic cooperations with the GCC states, evaluate the energies and non-energy sectors, the position of the GCC state and Iran, and also look at Sino-American rivalries and influence in the region and so on. It examined Chinese foreign policies from a holistic perspective, made it possible to obtain vital guidance in to build its relations with the GCC, and look to what extent the GCC states are important to Chinese foreign policies in the regions, how oil drives China foreign policy in the regions, and the way economic interest lies in the centers of China's approach to international relations. China has a long-standing interest in the Middle East. Like I said, pre-1978, it started informally at the Bandung Conference in 1955, where back then there's a lot of anti-imperialist and colonizations, the cultural interactions underlie Sino-Arab relations for the first time. China started its formal diplomatic relations precisely with the Persian Gulf regions from 1977 onward. And China's needs of energies make the region's potential partner due to its substantial oil and gas reserve. So Chinese foreign policy toward the Persian Gulf is designed primarily to strengthen the economic relations between both parties, as well as Iran. For 2021, crude oil from the Persian Gulf, I think Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, and Kuwait emerged as the top 10 providers to China. Look at the Chinese policy, non-interfering policy, non-interfering. This is why cooperation in energies and non-energy sector, together with the diplomatic ties, continue to grow between China and the GCC states. However, safeguarding regional maritime trade route and ensuring regional stability would also support Chinese economic growth as well. And in recent years, Beijing has been well aware of regional instabilities, tensions, and rivals, and consequently threatening whatever the threatening or affecting Chinese interests. Therefore, adhering to its 5 principles of its foreign policy for the peaceful coexistence and non-interference, Beijing encouraged dialogue, like strengthen the development, solution to tackling all the regional issues. As China is the world's largest oil importer, of its soft power, such as economic activities and corporations, ensures good connections with its leading supplier as well, like the BI and all. Energy security is an essential component of China's economic growth prospect. China's oil demand has almost tripled over the past 2 decades, accounting for 1/3 of global oil demand growth every year. For example, like before 1978, before Deng Xiaoping era, China consumed less than even 5% of world energies, but because of 1978, it's gradually changed, and it's become the number 1 importing crude oil. So this fact had led to formulating a comprehensive foreign policy, which encompassed, amongst other vital issues, partnerships in the broader Middle East and geostrategic multilateral corporations. So the relationship involved also BI, Belt and Road Initiative projects, while China's cooperation is also provided through the 1.2.3 strategy. Through this policy, China is increasing its importance in shaping the futures of the regions. For the GCC states, their important view depends on their ability to coordinate their activities and formulate a common policy to develop a free trade deal with China. Beijing provides the fundamental technology transfer, training, cooperation, infrastructural development the GCC state or the region's needs. The GCC states and Iran, for example, render China a stable trading atmosphere that guarantees a steady oil supply. Some countries in the regions have already created and sought to, implement a lookies policy to strengthen their relationship with China. So the goal of Chinese foreign policy can be a matter of engaging with mutual respect, being co-equal, being conscious of regional issues, and being non-interferent concerning the sovereignties of all parties. So to tread carefully with the Persian Gulf, Beijing needs to acknowledge the regional rivalry, like I mentioned, Tehran and Riyadh or among the GCC member or regional power play as well. So Chinese policy toward the Middle East formulate dissimilarly from American policy. Non-interference strategy allows China to navigate through regions' complexity without confrontation. Like BI is meaningful for Beijing and play its part in facilitating industrializations, promoting economic development, and last but not least, supporting regional stability. China used military cooperation, would say, contrarily to the U.S. The joint maritime training is to mitigate the problem from maritime choke points along the trade routes, where while the main appear like the military exercise, it is part of the BRI plan to safeguard and lessen the economic risk. So the instabilities of Persian Gulf regions, broader Middle East would also affect the stabilities of Chinese economic interests. And nevertheless, the region is important because BRI is also important. So I would say it remains to be seen if Beijing would apply a different approach to do whatever it takes to secure Chinese economic interests like Washington's doing. That would reverse its foreign policy traditions that all Chinese leaders have used since its informal diplomatic tie with the regions. However, with the current economic trend in the Persian Gulf seeking economic diversifications, to move beyond has suggested that the nation visions fit well with the Chinese foreign policy. Thank you very much. I think.
Thank you very much, Vorachai. Now we will move on to Dr. Ali Bakir, who will be discussing Chinese-Turkish competition and cooperation around the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Mehran, and congratulations again to the editors, contributors, and the publisher for this great work, and very timely, of course. I will be brief. I will not talk a lot. My chapter is about the emerging security role of Turkey and China in the Middle East, avoiding a possible clash in the future. So whenever I put Turkey, China, and the Middle East in one phrase, I usually receive an awkward reaction. And I believe that this is related to primarily three things. First, in the last 10 years or so, we got used to studying and working on mainly China and the US in the Middle East, or China and the Middle East. And when we discuss China and the Middle East, we usually focus on three countries: China, Iran, China, Saudi Arabia, and China, UAE, which are most important, obviously, partners for China in the region. And second, the asymmetric nature of relationship, if I would say, and weight also between Turkey and China in this sense. And the third reason would be that this chapter is discussing the future also. So it has a futuristic aspect, and not too much people are anticipating whether cooperation or clash between China and Turkey in the Middle East. They are mainly focusing, when it comes to Turkey, on Turkey's problematic relations with the US and with Russia. So in this sense, I assume that if, of course, two emerging powers with the increasing role in the Middle East, Turkey and China, if they stay on this course, then as the realist approach suggests, their interests might clash at certain point at certain time. So in order to discuss this issue, I divided my chapter into 4 main sections. In the first section, I discussed mainly I highlighted the importance of Turkey's middle corridor to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and in connection with the Middle East, I identified 3 possible economic sectors as an area for possible competition between Turkey and China in the Middle East, and these are construction and contracting sector, trade sector, and energy sector, with on the construction and contracting sector. Why? Because, as you may know, China is #1 in the world when it comes to construction and contracting sector, and many observers do not know that Turkey comes second in this sector worldwide. And this has been the situation for almost a decade and more, maybe 15 years. And the East is full of opportunities when it comes to this sector, and both are quite qualified to achieve and to compete, with a note that, of course, the Chinese companies has an advantage with the generous support from the Chinese government. In the second part of my chapter, I mapped the rising security-oriented involvement of Turkey and China in the Middle East, a special focus on their power projection capacity beyond their borders, especially when it comes to the region. I discussed when it comes to Turkey's defense industry and its role in foreign policy in the Middle East, and also its forward defense policy and forward deployments in the region, including in the Gulf, in the Levant, and in North Africa. When it comes to China, I also discussed the Chinese increasing presence around the region and indirect presence in the region itself, with a special focus, of course, on its presence in Pakistan, Djibouti, and also indirect presence in North Africa, which I will discuss later. In the third chapter, I discussed, of course, the increasing Chinese involvement in the Middle East and its impact on Turkey's national security and Turkey's interests in the Middle East, with a special focus on 3 major areas, which are the Gulf region and the Levant and North Africa. I mainly took some examples to illustrate my argument with Syria, Libya, and the Gulf, of course, plus Iraq. Now, when it comes to the Syria, the general wisdom is that Turkey, or this is how at least China frames its position, as a neutral player. But we found out that China backed Assad regime with around 10 veto decisions in the period between 2011 and 2020. And this is huge, because this constitutes more than 66% of all the vetoes used by China since it has acquired this right in the early 70s of the last century. Now, this behavior of China, which is of course not military or hard power, but it left serious security implications on Turkey when it comes to its relation with Syria, and it empowered Assad regime, and this had repercussions on many levels for Turkey, economy-wise, security-wise, social-wise, and of course, when it comes to politics. In Libya, for example, a different example of indirect encountering between the 2 countries, China again puts one leg with Haftar and the other leg with the UN-backed government in Tripoli. But in practice, the Chinese weapons, and especially drones, Winglong 1 and 2, plus other defense equipments, were used by Haftar against the Tripoli government, which was backed by Turkey, as everyone knows. And in many occasions, defense equipments of both parts had encounters. So also this constituted a risk to Turkey, its allies, and its competition in terms of defense equipments, in this particular case, drones. And in the Gulf, of course, I highlighted that the Gulf crisis enabled Turkey to play advanced security role in the Gulf for the first time since the fall of the Ottoman Empire around 100 years ago, when it deployed its troops in Doha and prevented the military escalation of the crisis. On the other hand, the increasing tensions between Iran and the US on the one hand, and Iran and its neighbors, Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, also enabled discussions on the possible security role of China in the Gulf. And at the time, the Chinese ambassador in the UAE uncovered that his government is discussing the possibility of certain formula if it needs to escort ships, etc. So there is an increasing discussion on a possible Chinese role security-wise, especially with the increasing economic interests of China in the region. And if these trends remains the same in the future, then China might also complicate Turkey's calculations of Turkey's security role in the Gulf. Now, in the fourth chapter, I laid out some policy recommendations on how to avoid such a scenario, which involves a possible clash between Turkey and China. So this was my chapter, and I hope I stayed with the limits of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakir. Not last but not least, we're going to Professor Sehar Sabir, who will have a presentation. Are you able to share your presentation? Dr. Sabir? Dr. Sabir?
It seems she's having a problem. At least what I have here is the message saying that she has a low bandwidth.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
She has sent me her presentation. She left the meeting.
Yeah, I think she lost her connection.
That is unfortunate.
I suggest, Mehran, if we have Peter,
Yes.
if he can.
Mr. Soden?
Mute, here I go. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I was supposed to be on earlier, but unfortunately my internet cut out as well. I'm Peter Souden from Routledge Publishers, publisher of this book. I love coming to book launches. I do this for a living. You get to meet all these people, some of whom you've only ever met as internet names, and here you all are. What a wonderful life I have. I publish maybe 60 or 70 books a year, mostly in area studies, some on the Middle East, some on Russia and Eastern Europe, some on the Far East, including China, a lot of books on China at present. And you have this luxury doing area studies of being able to interfere in all subjects, politics, history, sociology, even women's studies. And you see how everything fits together in the social sciences. You get a really rich intellectual feast of the overview without having to drill down into any great detail. Anyway, that's me. I think all good books should have their publication celebrated. Here we are celebrating it. I'm delighted to be with you all. I think it's a very good book. Anoush said quite a lot about the series earlier, which I second. We've published over 50 books. Good books, often young scholars from all over the world. I love bringing in people from all over the world to our publishing. It's also one of the things I noticed from going to book launches which I've normally done in person, is before the meeting's over, somebody will pop up to you and say, I've got another book. And very often there are more books that result from coming to book launches. So if anybody's got one, please come and find me. I'm now going to mute myself and go back to substantive content.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sabir, are you able to connect right now?
Yes, I'm connected. Sorry for disruption.
I can share your PowerPoint from my side. So
Okay. I can show from here as well. Okay. Sorry, everyone, first of all, and thank you very much for waiting for me. And my contribution to this book deals with China's changing posture towards Afghanistan. And I studied this changing posture of China towards Afghanistan through neoclassical realist point of view. So the order of my presentation will be as follows. First of all, I would introduce my chapter, including research question and with an argument and possibly with a theoretical explanation. And what is China's role in, what is Afghanistan's role in China's foreign policy, and what are the external and internal factors contributing towards this change, and then finally the conclusion. So September 11 not only marked the beginning or a reference point for a new era of politics, but it was also catastrophic for America and for the entire world as well, and more particularly for Afghanistan. And in the wake of war against terrorism, Afghanistan neighbors, although they stood with America in order to avoid spillover effect of the extremism, as well as to eradicate fear of the instability in region, which was being spread by the expansion of terrorism. So, and you can see all the neighbors, they stood with America in order to support eradication of this terrorism. China in this week also offered its assistance, but it was not accepted by that time. And you can see from northern side, northern distribution network was also established with the help of Russia and the Central Asian republics. So Afghanistan's geostrategic position is really significant for not only for China but for the major stakeholders in the conflict. It is located at the trilateral region of South Asia, Central Asia, and West Asia. It also connects China with the rest of the Middle East, and it makes it easier for China to access the natural resources of this region while having connecting from Afghanistan and for sure for Pakistan as well. And the troubled region is shown in this bracket is Wakhan corridor or the Wakhan district, which is directly territorially linked with Afghanistan. But at the same time, this is a non-porous border, but still it creates trouble for China from security point of view. So among neighbors of Afghanistan in the wake of post 9/11 situation, all neighbors they stood with America to help eradicate the fear of terrorism, but China behaved exceptionally, and it made a different course of action despite sharing common border with Afghanistan. It also had threat of instability and economic interest. Still, China behaved exceptionally. China maintained a somewhat eccentric policy. There has been a debate in China whether to keep the lowest profile or to emerge or to opt a new, more assertive policy. So in Afghanistan, China's policy can be regarded as keeping the lowest profile on Afghanistan. However, Chinese policy evolved from maintaining low-key position to gradual involvement and enhanced participation. But still, the non-interference principle, which is the basic principle of Chinese foreign policy, that remained intact, and it was another aim of China to preserve this non-interference principle. When I say enhanced participation, I mean that from 2001 to 2012, China maintained modest reconstruction aid only, and that was only limited to 250 million US dollars. China also signed strategic partnership agreement with uh, Afghanistan in 2012. But in 2014 alone, you can see that China pledged on 250 million US dollars. Not only aid, but also it offered training of 3,000 Afghan professionals. And politically, China was also actively involved, and in specifically in Istanbul meeting. China also hosted Heart of Asia Istanbul Process Fourth Ministerial Conference in Beijing, and in 2012, the then security chief also visited Kabul. His visit was also marked as important as this was the first Chinese most senior leaders visit in decades. And in 2012, China also endorsed the decision by the SU to make Afghanistan an observer. So you can see that China's participation was enhancing, and it was comparatively more actively engaged in political and economic field, and even in training of security forces, Afghan professionals. So the question emerges that why China had transformed its policy from restrained observer to vigorous actor in Afghanistan, and what explains this shift in Beijing's policy towards post-US situation in the region in general and Afghanistan in particular. So the argument is basically takes into account both external and internal variables. So the external factor that was the U.S. withdrawal policy announcement, or basically the FPA policy announced by Barack Obama by that time in 2009, it provided regional studies more rigorously considering domestic resources and relative position in the regional scenario. These states recalibrated their potentials accordingly. Simultaneously, and gradual transformation as more possibilities were put on the regional setup, creating competition for influence to maintain regional balance. Consequently, Afghanistan occupied significant position in the policy of interconnectedness in broader context of overall change in China's global policy. And the internal factor that is taken as Xi Jinping's Chinese President Xi's dream of rejuvenation of a great nation, peaceful rise and harmonious world. Additionally, the change of leadership at domestic level is taken as intervening factor to mobilize and invest more resources in Afghanistan. So this model explains all these three variables. The external variable that was, or you can call it the independent variable, that was U.S. withdrawal announcement, which led to uncertainty of future of Afghanistan, and for the future of that also created power vacuum in the region. There were more chances of rivals to get stronghold, including major regional powers in the which had stakes in Afghanistan. That also resulted into denuclearization of Afghanistan. And the intervening variable, when I talk about domestic factor, that was Xi's when he assumed power. So he gave the idea of China's peaceful rise. He also opted for new neighborhood policy, or new neighborhood diplomacy, in which he took the neighbors as the most the prime focus of Xi's foreign policy, including the OBOR, or the latest BRI project, the creation of AIIB, and it also changed China's global outlook. And that ultimately led to the active involvement in Afghanistan. In 2014, the aid was increased, and it made commitment up to 2017. It endorsed SCU observer status. It offered training, peace building, CPAC, and Afghanistan's participation in CPAC. And in 2015, China became the largest source of FDI. So what is Afghanistan's role in China's foreign policy? Basically, that has several dimensions. So, security-centric approaches deals with Afghanistan as a security concern for China. China is more concerned about its domestic security as compared to its external security. So, for Xinjiang, the region bordering with Afghanistan, that is a main concern for China's involvement in Afghanistan. At the same time, energy security based on Afghanistan's geostrategic position is also one of the major sources for growing concern for Afghanistan and China. and definitely economic interest cannot be excluded. So it is considered that China's greater involvement in Afghanistan is also intended strategy towards greater Central Asia, in terms of tapping more economic and business interests. And some of the explanations are also Pakistan centric, that Pakistan and Afghanistan are one region. So therefore, in case in order to have more stable region, China has to engage with all these states, and we cannot exclude India in all this situation. So India's enhancement of sphere of influence is also a concern for China, that China is growing its participation in this region. And definitely Afghanistan is a buffer zone which distinguishes the major powers' influence in the whole region. So the external factors which contributed, they can be summarized as FPAC policy and definitely the US withdrawal, border security and spillover effect of extremism, China's commercial interests, India's growing influence, and China's all-out multilateral approach. For internal factors, we can include domestic security, Xi's new neighborhood diplomacy, which announces common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security in Asia, and peace through economic development, which has been the main content of Xi's policy towards Afghanistan, that China, in the contemporary scenario, also rushed to provide humanitarian in Taliban-led Afghanistan. So conclusively, we can say that China adopts all-inclusive approach that is based on negotiation process with all stakeholders. Xi's signature policy of BRI, that is intended to include Afghanistan in this CPAC project as well. China is also playing its role to bridge the gap between Afghanistan and Pakistan to address instability in the region. Although China is cautious of direct engagement, but its primary focus is on managing threats of spillover effects, and US withdrawal, fall of Kabul, domestic security situation has increased Afghanistan's significance for China, and it also has created new opportunities for China to showcase its soft power, or as a test case of its soft power. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks again to all of the presenters, our contributors to this edited volume. It was great presentations from each of you. We now have a very short discussion session. If anyone has any questions or comments that they would like to raise, now would be the time. You may use the raise hand function if you would like. I would encourage you to also make comments on your fellow contributors in the book as well. Okay, I would mention one thing after Esfandyar. Okay.
I just had a general question, maybe for the group, and I think it's something that I've talked about with Jacopo before, and also with you, Mehran. But one of the difficulties in studying China's relations with countries in the region is that we tend to study it from the perspective of people in the region, or thinking from the standpoint of people in the region. I wonder if if the other contributors have any thoughts of what it would take for us to have a more joined up kind of community here, where, for example, there's a greater ability on our part to engage with Chinese source material or from scholars in China on some of these questions. So just sort of a kind of methodological question for the group, because it's something I think about a lot.
Yes, Luciano.
I can say something as a publisher. There's a lot of, Routledge has a whole series on the Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of those authors are people in China. There's a very good author, I think, at the University of Macau, who works on China and the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement. There's a book recently published, it's by a Polish person, on China's regions and the Belt and Road Initiative. So there's a lot of work going on, not a lot of it, I think, from inside China itself, but people do look at it from the Chinese perspective.
Luciano?
Yeah, one comment and one question that I assume is not going to be a fair question. One comment is that I was asked by some people why we didn't have more Chinese scholars presented in this book, having in mind that it's about China. And I explained to them what Mehran explained at the beginning. This was a result of a call for papers for a conference. We collected the best papers that were presented, and there were not many Chinese scholars participating. That is not that we didn't aim at getting more opinion from inside, but in any case, I think that the benefit we got from that is that the approaches that we received were much more varied than if we had most of the approaches coming from China. I think the diversity of approaches that we can see in this volume is one of the most important assets that we can provide to the readers. And the question is, I know it's unfair asking that, because we started this project following the Mehran initiative even before COVID. Then COVID happened. The process of writing happened along or during COVID times that affected China's economy and China's relation with all the countries, and this was reflected to some extent in most of the chapters. But now we have a totally different situation, post-COVID and in the middle of a war in Russia and Ukraine. I wonder if any of you, of the author, want to make a post-scriptum comment, very short comment about what you think could change in your chapter, considering what happened in the war. I mean, if there is something that changed in the relation. But I don't want you to write the whole piece again, but maybe in the second edition. But if one sentence each of you can say what you think happened in terms of your chapter.
Thank you very much for that question, Luciana. I think that's a great question, and it's worthwhile to hear what you all have to say on that in regards to how you would be able to update your chapters with the recent developments. If anyone would like to say anything, that'd be great. Dr. Bakir, you're muted.
Very much. I would say I'm very lucky because as I suggested before, I had to deal with the futuristic aspect of the relation. So I believe I wouldn't change much, but one thing that really got highlighted during the COVID is that the competition between China and Turkey increased because many Western countries assumed that Turkey should be an alternative for China when it comes to production lines. And the same also thinking happened in many Middle Eastern countries. So I think that when it comes to this aspect, it sort of assured what I have been saying on this regard. So the competition will intensify rather than decrease. I think so. So
thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Mohseni?
I think Jacopo was before me, but I'll go ahead. I think given the energy crisis in Europe, and given that the demand for Gulf, especially Qatar's natural gas, has been skyrocketing, there is going to be a lot more competition on the region's energy resources, and definitely China is going to be again a major player in this competition, and therefore I would assume that their involvement in the GCC countries is just going to increase even further moving down the road.
Thank you very much. Jacopo? Unmute, please.
Sorry. So yeah, of course, working on China and both COVID and the current Ukraine crisis have played a central role in this thinking. I would not add specifically at my chapter, but when we think about COVID, it's worth remembering that Iran was basically the first major country most badly hit outside East Asia. And this has a lot to do with all the contradictions and problems of the relationship with China. Not gonna through the news that were spread at that time, but it was clear that all the problems of that relationship played a role in that. And right now, what we are seeing is Iran, I think, wrongly siding with Russia, and somehow, China jumping on this idea of sort of post-Western order emerging from the war in Ukraine, and we have seen even in the past weeks, with Iran joining the SCO, this sort of hubris of a post-Western world where this new axis of China, Russia, and Iran increasingly coming together, which is, again, something that from a certain point of view sounds very, very well, sounds working, but has a lot of issues on the ground, I would say. So yeah, certainly it's clear that especially the Russian war in Ukraine is feeding this narrative that there's something else outside the West, and Iran should join that kind of more and more visibly. But yeah, yeah, I'll stop here. But
thank you very much, Jacopo. Yar, please unmute.
So if looking back to the chart that I showed, one of the things you might have noticed if you look closely was that Russia was actually one of the countries that has remained very much dependent on European machinery exports versus China. And so I think one of the things that would be interesting to look at now is if we are interested in this question of sanctions as a driver of changes in trade relationships, which of course takes place. To a large extent, Russia's industrial development did not depend on increased economic engagement with China, at least at the level of machinery imports. And so to the extent that we might now see increased Russian imports from China of those kinds of goods, I think there would be a stronger case to make that in the case of Russia, sanctions were a driver for a kind of turn east, and maybe less so in the case of Iran. So I think that would be an interesting sort of follow-up. And one thing that's been sort of interesting to see in the recent months is individuals who work on Russia kind of looking at the literature of Iran sanctions and the research on sanctions on Iran to understand how to frame their own work on what's about to happen to the Russian economy.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to also make a note on two things. One is we have a question posed in the chat box as well, but I've been receiving comments on this point before as well, with regards to the Chinese treatment of Uyghurs and Muslims inside China, and how would that relate to this book. So we decided that this book would look at Chinese foreign policy abroad, not inside China. And we tried to incorporate any chapter that had a link to the situation with regards to Chinese treatment of its Muslim citizens, as well as its relations with the Muslim world, as far as we could. But the focus of the book was not on internal matters within China. So that's why we did not have a chapter on it, nor did we focus on it. But if anyone would like to make a comment on that point, there is a question posed now as well. If not, I would also want to mention one thing. When in 2019 we released the call for abstracts, the conference was supposed to be in both English and Arabic. And from the more than 40 abstracts that we received, the 20 that we accepted, then there were 11 left at the end with the working papers. But there was also the same number for the Arabic chapters as well. And unfortunately, the conference didn't take place, and the Arabic publication didn't move ahead as planned. But there were many other topics that would have been covered at the conference or in the other book as well. But we are hopeful that we could continue this relationship with the contributors in this book, and hopefully work on something else in the near future as well. If there are any other comments, I would be more than happy to hear them. If not, we should say goodbye. Dr. Zaccara.
I have a very brief. I know that I am annoying with my questions, that they are about things that happened after the book was published. But one wonders, many things happen, unfortunately. Maybe we should discuss with Peter another book or a second edition. Mainly this directed to Amin, Esfandyar, and Jacopo. Iran lately requested to join BRICS and requested to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These are two major membership that could change to some extent the relation between China and Iran, or not, or that do they have these two elements significance in the relation between both countries? What do you think?
Mohseni,
Well,
Jacopo.
well, let me start. I'll leave to Yar and Dr. saying the economic aspect of that. What I think, from my perspective, a more policy or political aspect of that. What is interesting is I think I brought for a publication that Yar edited 1 or 2 years ago, that joining the SCO was a good chance for Iran to make its relationship with China more institutionalized. Because one of the thing I've encountered doing my research on China-Iran, one of the biggest problems this relationship has is that there's very little institutionalization. And in a chapter I wrote for another book, I said that the main issue with China-Iran relations is not about the quantity of trades and exchanges and so on, but it's the quality of this relationship. And so if we take off all this narrative of a new world order building up in the East and so on, the non-Western aspect of all of this and so on, I think this for Iran could be a good step to make its relationship with its external relationship, and in this particular case, its relationship with China more institutionalized. So in that sense, this is a good step. Still, it's still a long journey. It's not that joining the SCO or the BRICS will completely change the picture, but is a first important step in that direction.
Thank you very much. Yar or Dr. Mohseni, would you like to make a comment?
So just to build on Jacopo's point, I think the idea that this is a pathway to institutionalizing the relationship is an excellent way of thinking about it. I guess the question that would arise for me is the institution itself functional enough and providing the right sort of pathways and opportunities for the kind of political and economic and security engagements that would see a deeper partnership? And looking to the recent SCO meeting in Uzbekistan, I think there are question marks over the kind of health of the organization, because of course, China has its own designs for what this bloc is meant to do. But, the sort of junior partner in the bloc, Russia, is engaged in a war right now that's straining Russia's relations with many of the other SCO members, like the Central Asian states. So I think that, even if institutionalizing the relationship is a goal, it's not clear to me that organizations like the BRICS or SCO are mature enough themselves that it really gives Iran the right pathways. At best, you get a meeting every year where Iran can maintain its bilateral engagement with China, and there is some value there. But, with an agenda-setting kind of mindset, it's not totally clear to me that SCO is really going to deliver much other than kind of an opportunity for showboating.
Thank you very much.
If I may add to the great points mentioned by Esfandyar and Jacopo, yes, we have to put this in context also with the 25-year agreement that Iran had with China, which it's vague what the agreement includes. It's very high level. There's no specificities right now. But this is again another step, as Esfandyar and Jacopo mentioned, of institutionalizing that relationship even further. But I'm very worried about the fact that Iran is putting, if not all, but most of its eggs in China's baskets. and moving down the road. I mean, Iran has been burned by doing that, putting most of its eggs in European basket in the past after JCPOA and ignoring Chinese involvement in the country more often. But now it's this shift towards the east and not diversifying its economic relations with the rest of the world. That is worrisome to me down the road.
Thank you very much. If there are no other comments, we should end now. Thank you again, Professor Ehteshami, for your support. Peter, thank you very much again. And to our contributors, thanks a lot. I hope we can work again.
Absolute pleasure. I look forward to the next volume.
Yes, inshallah.
Sure.
A great evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.